There is a fork in the river country of eastern Kentucky that the county surveys draw three different ways, and none of the three agree with each other or with what a man finds when he walks it. The locals call it Raven Fork, though no bird colony ever nested there that anyone recorded, and the name predates any naturalist who might have explained it. Men who tried to run a line through it came back with numbers that would not close. A rope stretched taut from one bank to the other measured different lengths depending on which direction you pulled it. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The old logging road that once reached the head of the fork was graded, then left to gravel, then left to nothing, and the men paid to maintain it were quietly reassigned before anyone thought to ask why. For close to 130 years, the families in the valley below have kept one rule: they never wrote on a sign and never had to. You do not go up into Raven Fork past dusk, and you do not speak the family name that has lived at the top of it since before anyone can properly account for. This is the story of the Tetlow clan, what the county did to erase every trace of them from its own books, and why the people at the mouth of that fork still count their children before supper and count them again before bed. To understand the Tetlows, you first have to understand the ground they picked. Raven Fork is not a hollow shaped like the others that cut into that ridgeline. It is a narrow trench where two slopes lean so far toward each other at the crown that the sun does not properly reach the floor until well past 9 in the morning, and it leaves again before 4 in the afternoon. The creek that should drain downhill instead pools in 3 low basins and sits there black and still even after a hard rain. The first families who settled that stretch of the mountains, the ones who claimed the good bottomland and named the good creeks, walked the mouth of that fork and turned around. They left no deed, no claim, no complaint filed against it. They simply left it alone, the way you leave alone a dog that has never bitten anyone, but that you have never once seen wag its tail either. The surveyors sent up there in later years are worth dwelling on, because their trouble was not the ordinary trouble of steep ground. A competent surveyor can chain a mountainside. What the men sent into Raven Fork reported instead was distance that refused to hold still. One line run along the northern wall came back 11 rods longer than the same line run the opposite direction an hour later. A deputy surveyor named Corwin Aldrich wrote in his field book, the only page of it that survives, that he had paced the floor of the fork at 380 steps, going in, and better than 540 coming back out, on the same afternoon, with the same 2 legs, and that he sat down on a wet stone afterward, and did not trust his own count for the first time in 26 years of honest surveying work. The county filed his numbers in a drawer, and never sent another man up to correct them. A geologist who passed through decades later, hired by a timber concern that wanted the fork's hardwood, took his own readings and quietly told his employer the contract was not worth the trouble, though he never gave a technical reason on paper. The timber company let the lease lapse within the year and never inquired further. The Tetlows arrived sometime after the war, though no year is fixed to it in any register that has come down to us. There is no purchase on file, no grant, no bill of sale, no signature anywhere claiming that ground. One autumn the head of the fork was empty, and the next there was smoke coming up out of the trees, and a family settled at the point where the 2 ridges finally meet. Nobody in the valley remembered selling them anything. Nobody remembered them passing through on their way up. They were simply there, the way a water stain is simply there on a ceiling you have looked at for years and only now notice for the first time. At first they were left be, because that is the custom of that country. A family that keeps to itself earns the right to keep doing so. The Tetlows came down to the Crossroads store at the mouth of the valley a handful of times each season, bringing cured hides and jarred honey, and, now and again, old silver coin worn so smooth that the faces on it could not be made out. Corbin once sent 3 of those coins off to a jeweler in Lexington for an opinion, hoping to learn something of their origin, and the letter that came back said only that the metal tested heavier than any silver alloy the jeweler had handled in 30 years of trade, and that he would rather not keep the samples in his shop any longer than it took to mail them home. Their trade was fair and their words were few, and in years of dealing with the store they never once invited a soul from the valley up to see where they lived. That was the whole arrangement for a long stretch of years, a quiet family at the head of a quiet fork, and the valley told itself the same comfortable story it tells about anyone who keeps to the high ground. That comfort held right up until the handful of people who dealt with the Tetlows most regularly began noticing the same impossible thing, independently of each other, and found they could not talk themselves out of it again. There was a man named Silas Corbin who kept that Crossroads store the better part of 41 years. Late in his life, he told his granddaughter the one detail about the Tetlows that had never once left him. It was that the Tetlow who came down to trade stayed exactly the same man across all those years, in every visible detail. His son never grew into his face, and no nephew ever took his place at the counter. The same low black hat came through that door decade after decade. The same pale hands folded the same way while his goods were weighed. The same unhurried count of coin laid out one piece at a time, and Corbin himself went from a boy sweeping his father's floor to an old man bent over his own ledger, while the man across the counter simply did not age. When Corbin finally worked up the nerve to say so aloud, just the once, the man looked at him for a long, quiet stretch, gathered his goods without a word, and did not come back down out of the fork for the better part of 9 years. The first real sign that something in that family was wrong was not a scream or a body turning up. It was arithmetic. A circuit preacher named Ezra Vane, who rode that valley for decades, kept a careful ledger of every soul he baptized and every soul he buried, and in the surviving pages that cover his years near Raven Fork, there sits a slow and patient horror. The Tetlow household kept adding names to his baptismal count year after year, and the earlier names never once moved into the next age bracket. There were always infants. There were never any of those infants grown old. One name in Vane's ledger deserves particular attention. A girl child recorded as Opal Tetlow first entered the year Vane took over that circuit. She is baptized in his careful hand as a newborn, and she is recorded as a newborn again in entries dated more than 50 years apart, in the same shaking hand of a man by then quite old, who by all evidence understood exactly what he was writing down, and kept writing it anyway, because a man in his calling does not stop counting souls simply because the count has begun to frighten him. Opal Tetlow appears in that ledger as a newborn no fewer than 7 separate times. Vane never once recorded a Tetlow death. Other things were noticed after that. A trapper who followed an injured fox too far up the fork came back 4 days later with his beard gone entirely white, and would not describe what he had seen, only that the cabins up there were older than the people living in them, and that some of the doorways were cut straight into the hillside rock. A young woman from the valley who had been courting a Tetlow son went up one Sunday to meet his people and never came back down. When her father went looking for her, the family met him at the tree line, courteous as always, and told him she had left for the city in the night. He did not believe a word of it, but when he tried to push past them, his own legs would not carry him forward, and he stood weeping at that line of trees until dark before he turned for home. By the turn of the century, the disappearances followed a shape that even the sheriff could no longer talk his way around. It was never the whole fork that took a person. It was always the same errand. A tax assessor sent up to collect, a surveyor sent up to redraw the boundary, a deputy sent up to ask a single plain question. The county would send a man up on official business, and the county would not get him back. Not his body, not his mule, not his hat left lying beside the trail. He went up whole, and Raven Fork kept the whole of him. There was a federal census taken in that decade, and the enumerator assigned to the district was a careful young man named Thaddeus Kirk, who took his duty seriously and went up into the fork despite everyone in the valley telling him not to. He came back down, which was itself unusual, but the pages he turned in for the Tetlow household were what set the whole district talking. He had filled every column correctly, names, ages, relation to head of household, in a firm and educated hand. Then, sometime after he left the fork and before he reached the courthouse, he had gone back through every single line and pressed his pen so hard through the ages column that he tore clean through the paper. Every age scratched to a black wound on the page. He would not explain why. He requested a transfer to a district 2 states away, and got it, and the note beside his name in the personnel file says only that he was found unfit for further field work. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. One detail turned ordinary fear into something colder. Men who went up on friendly terms, the traders, the courting boys, the merely curious, most of them came back changed but alive. The men who went up carrying the county's authority never came back at all. It was as though the fork could tell the difference between a person who came asking and a person who came to measure, to record, to bring that ground under the pen and the ledger and the law. Those men it swallowed without a trace, leaving their unfinished paperwork behind on a desk in town. A bank examiner sent up in the 1890s to assess a disputed timber claim near the fork's mouth left behind a satchel and a half-finished cup of coffee in his hotel room, and was never seen in that county again, and the last entry in his own daybook, found weeks later, folded into a coat he had left hanging by the door, read only that the light in the fork did not fall the way light should, and that he intended to ask someone about it in the morning. There was no morning entry after that. The county tried exactly once. In a year the surviving records leave conspicuously blank, to send an armed party up into Raven Fork. What became of that group survives nowhere in any file a person can request today. It survives only in the way the descendants of those men still go quiet when the subject comes up, and in one line scratched into the back of a courthouse door that a clerk later tried to sand away and never quite managed. The line said that 13 men went up, and the mountain sent down 11 coffins, all of them light as empty boxes, with an unmistakable instruction attached that the county stop counting. The 11 coffins were buried down in the valley cemetery, not up in the fork, and for a single generation their graves were kept and tended. Then the tending stopped all at once. The year a caretaker went to mow that corner of the yard and found the earth over every one of the 11 sunken, as though the boxes beneath had been quietly emptied out from underneath. Nobody dug to check. The county by then had already begun its long, patient work of forgetting, and a sunken grave is easy enough to sod over and easier still to stop visiting. Those 11 names sit in the private reconstruction of this history, along with everything else the public record was never permitted to keep. They are the last people Raven Fork was ever officially permitted to take. The maps themselves still carry the fingerprints of what happened next. Faced with a place it could not police and could not conquer, the county did the only thing left to a frightened institution. It decided that Raven Fork would simply stop existing on paper. Having learned the hard way that it could neither burn the place out nor wall it off, the men who ran the county in those years, whose names are carved into the good buildings downtown to this day, met and made a decision that was never once entered into the public minutes. They ordered the fork undrawn. The logging road was struck from the maintenance rolls. Its name was lifted clean off the survey plats. The handful of families who had lived nearest the mouth of the fork were quietly paid to relocate, the money drawn from no fund that appears on any ledger. Within a single generation, an official could search every book the county kept and find no Raven Fork anywhere in them, no road leading there, no family taxed there, no deaths recorded there, because to record a death you first have to admit there is a place where a person can die. The fork was gone in the only way that mattered to the men holding the pens. They had not defeated the Tetlows. What they had done was stranger than that, and far more unsettling if you sit with it. They had agreed, as a body, to look away, and then they had made the looking away into policy. Nobody who has read the reconstructed record honestly will tell you they know for certain what the Tetlows were, or what arrangement kept that fork in its strange, ageless stillness. The most careful version of the story, the one the oldest families still tell in the fewest possible words, holds that the Tetlows were never the thing to fear. They were its price. Something far older than any family had lived in that cut since before the first settlers thought to avoid it, and the Tetlows were the shape it wore when it wanted to walk down and buy honey and coin at the Crossroads store. In this telling, the children who never grew older are not children at all. They are the face the fork wears to keep the valley from asking harder questions, soft enough to leave a grieving father weeping at the tree line instead of burning the whole cut down. And then, quietly, the disappearances stopped. That is the detail nobody in the valley much likes to sit with. The moment the county stopped sending men up to measure and to collect, the fork stopped taking them. It wanted the ground left off the map. Once it got exactly that, it went quiet, the way a sleeping thing goes quiet, which is nothing like being gone. In our own time, somebody always tries. A hiker with a good camera. A pair of college students flying a drone. One man who pulled up the satellite view and noticed the mapping service had smeared that single fold of mountain into a grey blur it used nowhere else in the county, the particular kind of blur that usually only covers ground a government has specifically asked to keep unseen. The hiker's photographs came back fogged only in the frames facing up the fork. The drone returned to its owners on its own, battery drained, carrying 40 minutes of footage that showed nothing but the same 11 grey headstones filmed over and over, though the operators swear they never once aimed it at the valley cemetery. The man with the satellite view kept scrolling, and could not find the road he had personally driven that same afternoon, because on every map that counts, the road he drove does not exist. A retired schoolteacher who has spent the better part of a decade collecting what remains of this history from attics and estate sales, says she has found 4 separate family Bibles in that county, with a page cut cleanly out wherever the Tetlow name would have appeared beside a marriage or a birth, the incision so careful that it could only have been done with a straight blade and a steady, patient hand, and never once with scissors in a hurry. She keeps those Bibles now in a fireproof box, and will not say exactly where. Everything the county did to bury this place worked precisely as intended, and that is its own kind of proof. There is no historical marker at Raven Fork. There is no park boundary, no line on any current atlas where the fork ought to sit. Drive the back roads up there and you will pass the mouth of a cut between 2 close ridges, where the pavement simply gives out for no reason an engineer would ever sign off on, and there will be no sign telling you what it once was. That absence is not an accident. It is a decision made by men in a room, dressed up as protection for the rest of us, pretending a wound in the world was simply never there to begin with. Maybe the men who undrew Raven Fork were cowards. Or maybe, and this is harder to sit with, they were among the bravest people in this whole account, because they looked directly at something the rest of us would rather not believe in, and instead of pretending to be strong enough to beat it, they quietly took its name away and prayed that would be enough. 130 years later, the fork is still there. The family that never grew old is still, by every honest accounting, unaccounted for. And the people at the mouth of that place still teach their children the oldest lesson those mountains ever handed down. Some doorways are cut into the hillside for a reason. Some names are kept off the map to keep them from ever being spoken aloud again. And some things you neither defeat nor outrun. You only agree, generation after generation, not to look at them directly, and you count your children twice, and you get them inside before the dark comes all the way down the fork. The schoolteacher with her fireproof box says she means to publish what she has gathered someday, though she has said this for years now, and the box has only gotten heavier. She says the hardest part is not finding the record. Records surface if you are patient, and know which attics to ask about. The hardest part is convincing anyone still living in that valley to speak the name out loud into a recorder, on the record, where it can be checked and kept and cited, rather than pass the old way, mouth to ear, in the low voice people there still use for it without quite noticing they have lowered their voice at all. Until that changes, the Tetlow name survives mostly the way it always has, carried sideways through people who were told not to say it, and said it anyway, just quietly enough that the saying never quite counted as speaking it aloud. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.